I never wanted to inherit my grandmother's house. When the lawyer called to inform me that I was the sole beneficiary of her estate, my first instinct was to decline. But sitting in my cramped studio apartment, drowning in student debt, the prospect of a free house in rural Vermont began to sound more appealing. I hadn't seen my grandmother since I was 12, and the memories I had of her were hazy at best. She was a recluse, people said, living alone in that sprawling Victorian house for the last 30 years of her life. The house needs work, the lawyer warned me during our meeting. It's been neglected. That was an understatement. When I first pulled up to the property, I almost drove right past it. The once white paint had peeled away to reveal weather-beaten wood underneath, and thick vines had claimed the entire east side of the house. The front yard was a jungle of overgrown grass and wild raspberry bushes. The key stuck in the lock, requiring several minutes of jiggling before the door finally creaked open. The musty smell hit me first, decades of trapped air and decay. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. The furniture was all covered in yellowed sheets, like ghosts frozen in time. I spent that first day opening windows and taking inventory. The house was huge, 4 bedrooms upstairs, a formal dining room, a library, and what must have once been a beautiful sunroom. Everything was exactly as my grandmother had left it, down to the half-empty tea cup on the kitchen counter, now home to a thick layer of dust. It wasn't until sunset that I noticed something odd. As the light faded, the temperature in the house dropped dramatically. I chalked it up to poor insulation and pulled on a sweater. But then I heard it, a soft humming coming from somewhere upstairs. It was a melody I almost recognized, like a half-remembered lullaby. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. The humming stopped immediately, probably just the wind. I told myself, though I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing right behind me. That night, I slept in what had been my grandmother's room. The bed was still made with faded floral sheets, and a collection of old photographs lined the dresser. In one, my grandmother stood in front of the house, much younger than I'd ever known her. She wasn't smiling. None of the photos showed her smiling. I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. The digital clock on my phone cast a blue glow across the room, but something else caught my attention. There was a shadow on the wall, a dark silhouette of a woman in a long dress, standing perfectly still. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The shadow remained on the wall for several seconds before slowly fading away. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to be rational. Old houses make strange shadows. The trees outside, the moonlight, my own tired mind. There were plenty of explanations that didn't involve anything supernatural. The next morning, I started cleaning. The library seemed like a good place to begin. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, all packed with leather-bound volumes. As I dusted, I noticed something peculiar about the books. Many of them were handwritten journals, dozens of them, all in my grandmother's precise handwriting. I picked one at random and opened it. The entry was dated June 15, 1983. It's getting stronger. The binding spell isn't working anymore. I can hear it scratching at the walls at night, trying to get in. The protection circles need to be renewed, but I'm so tired. So very tired. If anyone finds these journals, please understand. I didn't mean to let it in. I didn't know what would happen when I answered its call. I closed the journal, my hands shaking slightly. This had to be fiction, right? My grandmother writing strange stories to pass the time? But as I looked through more journals, they all contained similar entries, becoming more frantic and desperate in the later years. The last entry was dated just 3 days before her death. "I'm sorry, Emma. I should have warned you, but they wouldn't let me contact you. They said you were the only one who could continue the work after I'm gone. The house chose you. It's been waiting for you. Please forgive me for what I've done." I dropped the journal. She had written my name. How had she known I would inherit the house? Why me? That's when I heard the humming again, louder this time, coming from behind the bookshelves. And underneath it, another sound. A scratching, scraping noise, like something trying to claw its way through the walls. I backed away from the bookshelves, my heart racing. One of the books fell from its shelf, then another, and another. They began hitting the floor in a rhythm that matched the humming. And then, in the mirror hanging on the far wall, I saw her, my grandmother, looking exactly as she had in those old photographs, standing right behind me. But when I spun around, I was alone in the library. The books had stopped falling. The humming had ceased. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. That night, I packed my bags. I wasn't going to stay another night in that house. But as I reached for my car keys, they vanished right before my eyes. I searched everywhere, growing increasingly frantic. They were just gone. The humming started again, this time from every room at once. The temperature plummeted until I could see my breath in the air. And then I heard my grandmother's voice, clear as day, whispering right in my ear. "You can't leave, Emma. The house won't let you. We have work to do." The next morning, my car wouldn't start. Neither would my phone. When I tried walking down the long driveway, the gravel path seemed to stretch endlessly before me, never getting any closer to the road. After an hour of walking, I could still see the house looming behind me, exactly the same distance away as when I'd started. I had no choice but to go back inside. The journals in the library called to me. If I was trapped here, I needed to understand why. I spent hours reading through them, piecing together my grandmother's story. She had moved to the house in 1975, after my grandfather's death. At first, everything was normal, but then she started hearing things. Whispers in empty rooms, footsteps in the halls, that same haunting melody that I'd heard. She wrote about doors opening by themselves, objects disappearing and reappearing in strange places. But it was more than just a haunting. My grandmother had discovered something in the basement, a door that hadn't been there before, covered in strange symbols. And behind that door, the next several pages were missing, torn out. When the entries resumed, my grandmother's writing had changed. She wrote about rituals now, about binding spells and protection circles, about something she called the Watchers, entities that existed between worlds, neither alive nor dead. "They showed me things," she wrote. "Terrible, wonderful things. They offered me knowledge, power, immortality. All they wanted in return was a vessel. Someone young, someone with the right bloodline." My hands trembled as I read the last few entries. She had made a deal with these entities, but something had gone wrong. The price was higher than she'd expected. They didn't just want a vessel, they wanted a successor. Someone to continue their work in our world. Someone like me. That night, the dreams began. I saw my grandmother standing in a circle of candles in the basement, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The walls bled black ichor, and shapes moved in the shadows. Tall, impossibly thin figures with too many limbs. They reached for her with hands made of darkness, and she reached back. I woke up screaming, but the dream didn't end. The shadows in my room were moving, writhing like living things. And in the corner, my grandmother stood watching me, her eyes completely black. "They're ready for you now, Emma," she said, but her mouth didn't move. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The transition has already begun. Can't you feel it?" I could. My skin felt too tight, like something was trying to push its way out from inside me. When I looked in the mirror, my reflection smiled back at me with sharp, needle-like teeth that I knew weren't mine. The next few days blurred together. Time seemed to move strangely in the house, sometimes fast, sometimes agonizingly slow. I would blink and find myself in different rooms with no memory of how I got there. The humming was constant now, and sometimes I caught myself humming along to that otherworldly melody. I found more journals hidden throughout the house. They revealed the true history of my family. Generations of women who had served as vessels for the Watchers. My grandmother hadn't chosen me. I had been chosen before I was born. The house was just a gateway, a place where the veil between worlds was thin enough for them to reach through. One night, as I sat in the library reading, the books began to bleed. Black liquid dripped from their pages, forming pools on the floor that reflected images of impossible places, vast cities of non-Euclidean geometry, forests made of crystalline trees that sang in voices like breaking glass. The shadows gathered around me, taking more solid forms. They whispered promises of power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. All I had to do was say yes. All I had to do was let them in. My grandmother's spirit watched from the corner, her face a mask of mingled hope and despair. "I tried to protect you," she whispered. "I tried to find another way, but they always get what they want in the end." The humming grew louder, becoming a chorus of alien voices that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. The walls of the house began to pulse like a living thing, and I could feel something vast and ancient pressing against the boundaries of reality, trying to break through. The house began to change. The walls stretched and twisted, forming impossible angles. Doors opened onto rooms that couldn't exist, hallways that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Reality was becoming thin, malleable. I found myself in the basement, though I couldn't remember walking there. The door my grandmother had written about was there, pulsing with a sickly green light. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to move and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The watchers gathered around me, their forms more solid now. They were beautiful and terrible, beings of pure geometry and impossible colors, their movements like liquid mathematics. They showed me visions of what I could become, of the power that awaited me. I saw myself transcending human limitations, becoming something vast and eternal. I saw the secrets of creation laid bare, the underlying code of reality itself. All of space and time would be mine to explore and manipulate. But I also saw the price. In the reflective black pools that covered the floor, I saw what had really happened to my grandmother, to all the women in my family who had come before. They hadn't died. They had been transformed, broken down, and rebuilt into something else, something that only looked human on the surface. The humming reached a crescendo, and the door began to open. Behind it was everything, nothing, a void filled with eyes and teeth and fractals that went on forever. The watchers moved closer, their many limbs reaching for me. "It's time," they said in voices like breaking stars. "Take your place. Complete the circle. Become what you were always meant to be." My grandmother's spirit stood beside me, her form flickering between human and something else. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting our family. I thought I was giving us power. But we were never meant to have this knowledge. Some doors should stay closed." In that moment, I understood what I had to do. The journals hadn't just contained descriptions of rituals to summon the watchers. They also contained banishing spells, ways to close the gates between worlds. My grandmother had found them but had been too afraid to use them, too seduced by the promise of power. I began to recite the words I had memorized, my voice joining the humming but changing it, disrupting its patterns. The watchers screamed in frequencies that shattered the basement windows. Their forms began to unravel. "You cannot stop this," they howled. "You belong to us. The bloodline is bound." But I kept reading, even as reality buckled around me. The house shook, and the walls began to bleed shadows. My grandmother's spirit started to fade. "Finish it," she urged. "Break the cycle. Set us free." The final words of the spell felt like fire in my mouth. The door in the basement began to close, and the watchers were pulled back into their dimension. Their screams echoed through every room of the house, and I felt their influence being torn from my mind. The house collapsed in on itself, not physically but dimensionally, folding into spaces that shouldn't exist. When it was over, I found myself standing in a normal basement, in a normal house. The door was gone. The humming had stopped. My grandmother's spirit appeared one last time, but she was different now, human, at peace. "Thank you," she said. "We're free now. All of us." She faded away, and I was alone. I still live in the house. It's just a house now, old and in need of repair, but no longer a gateway between worlds. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear a faint humming, but it's distant, like a radio playing in another room. The watchers are still out there, I know, seeking new doors, new vessels, but they can't reach me anymore. I've kept the journals, though. Someone needs to remember what happened here, to keep the knowledge of how to close the doors. Just in case they find another family, another house, another way in, because some inheritances are better left unclaimed, and some doors should never be opened. The antique shop shouldn't have been there. I'd walked down this street in downtown Boston hundreds of times over the past 5 years, ever since taking my job at the university library. The narrow storefront between Beacon Street Coffee and yesterday's books had always been empty, its windows covered with brown paper and a perpetual for-lease sign. But on that cold October morning, something had changed. An ornate wooden sign hung above the door, its gold letters spelling out, "The Collector's Cabinet," in elegant script that seemed to shimmer despite the overcast sky. I stood on the sidewalk, coffee cooling in my hand, and studied the display window. The brown paper was gone, replaced by an elaborate arrangement of curiosities that made my anthropologist's heart beat faster. Victorian medical instruments laid out on faded velvet, their brass and silver surfaces gleaming dully. Carved masks from what appeared to be various African and Asian traditions, their empty eyes somehow following my movement. Porcelain dolls in elaborate period dress, their faces painted with unsettling detail. And at the center of it all, a Chinese scholar's desk from what looked like the Qing dynasty, its surface covered in mysterious implements I couldn't quite identify. A gust of wind sent fallen leaves skittering across my feet, and I shivered, though not entirely from the cold. Something about the display felt wrong, as if the objects were merely playing at being inanimate. I could have sworn one of the dolls had turned its head slightly while I wasn't looking directly at it. I should have walked away. I was already running late for my morning class, Introduction to East Asian Art and Archaeology, where 20 freshmen were probably already slouched in their seats, scrolling through their phones. But the jade pendant around my neck had grown uncommonly warm, almost seeming to pulse against my skin. The pendant was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of women in my family. According to my grandmother, it had once belonged to a powerful sorceress during the Ming Dynasty, who used it to trap malevolent spirits that threatened the imperial court. "Never take it off, May," she had whispered on her deathbed, pressing it into my hands. "It will protect you from things that hunger for souls." I dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying woman clinging to old superstitions. Yet in the 7 years since then, I'd found myself unable to remove the pendant, no matter how hard I tried. The clasp simply wouldn't open. Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself pushing open the heavy wooden door. A brass bell rang overhead, its tone unexpectedly deep and resonant, seeming to echo far longer than it should have. The interior was dimly lit by antique oil lamps that cast long shadows across crowded shelves. The air smelled of old books and polished wood, with an underlying metallic tang that reminded me of blood. Display cases lined the walls, their glass surfaces slightly warped with age. The objects inside seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. A jade figurine that was a dancer from one perspective and a crouching demon from another. A scroll painting whose landscape rearranged itself when I wasn't looking directly at it. A bronze vessel whose inscriptions appeared to crawl across its surface like insects. My pendant grew warmer still, and I noticed that many of the objects seemed to have a subtle glow about them, visible only from the corner of my eye. The glow pulsed in rhythm with my pendant, creating patterns that made my head hurt when I tried to focus on them. "Welcome, Ms. Chun." The voice came from behind me, causing me to jump and nearly drop my coffee. I turned to find an elderly man in a perfectly tailored three-piece suit of dark burgundy wool, his silver hair neatly combed back from a face that might have been handsome once, but now reminded me of a bird of prey. "I've been expecting you. How do you know my name?" I asked, taking an involuntary step backward. My heel hit something solid, and I turned to find that the door had vanished, replaced by another display case filled with what appeared to be human bones arranged in complex geometric patterns. He smiled, though it didn't reach his pale blue eyes that seemed to reflect light that wasn't present in the dim shop. "Oh, we know all our customers here at the Collector's Cabinet, especially those with particular interests." He gestured to my pendant with long, elegant fingers that seemed to have too many joints. "That's a fascinating piece. Ming Dynasty, if I'm not mistaken. Created by the sorceress Zhang Mei for the Jiajing Emperor in 1548. Used for more than just decoration, I believe." My hand instinctively went to the pendant, which was now hot enough to be uncomfortable. "How could you possibly know that? Even I don't know its exact history." "My dear, history is my business. Or perhaps I should say histories. All the countless versions of the past that might have been, could have been, should have been." He moved behind a counter I hadn't noticed before, his movements too smooth, as if he were gliding rather than walking. We collect more than just objects here. We collect possibilities. From beneath the counter, he withdrew a lacquered wooden box decorated with intricate carvings of intertwined dragons. The dragons seemed to writhe and twist as he set the box down, their wooden forms moving with liquid grace. I have something that might interest you. A perfect complement to your pendant. The box hummed with a subtle energy that made my skin prickle and my teeth ache. As he opened it, I caught a glimpse of something metallic inside. An ancient bronze mirror, its surface darkened with age, but somehow still reflective. Strange symbols were carved around its rim, similar to those found on oracle bones from the Shang dynasty, but subtly wrong in ways I couldn't quite identify. Early Han dynasty, he explained, lifting the mirror with reverence. Used by imperial mystics for scrying. They said it could reveal the true nature of things and people. He held it out to me. Would you like to see? Everything about this situation screamed danger. My academic training in archaeology and art history told me the mirror was impossible. Its style was unlike anything from the Han period, and the symbols were nonsensical. My pendant was now painfully hot against my skin, and I could hear a high-pitched whining sound at the edge of my perception. But I found myself reaching for the mirror anyway, my arm moving as if controlled by someone else. The moment my fingers touched its surface, the shop around me seemed to ripple like a disturbed pond. The walls became fluid, objects on the shelves melted and reformed, and the ceiling opened up into an impossible void filled with writhing shapes and distant lights that might have been stars. In the mirror's reflection, I saw the old man's true form, a towering figure of shadow and mist, with countless eyes that glowed like dying stars. Tendrils of darkness extended from his form, connecting to every object in the shop like puppet strings. Some of those tendrils were reaching for me. I tried to drop the mirror, but my fingers wouldn't release it. The old man, or whatever he really was, smiled again, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that extended far too far back into his head. The transaction is complete, he said, his voice now echoing as if from a great distance and seeming to come from multiple sources at once. The mirror has chosen you, as we knew it would. Do enjoy your purchase, Miss Chen. I'm sure we'll be seeing you again very soon. After all, everyone returns to the collector's cabinet eventually. It's simply a matter of which version of themselves makes the journey. The world tilted sideways, reality folding in on itself like origami made of space-time. And I found myself standing on the sidewalk outside. The storefront between the coffee shop and bookstore was empty again. Brown paper covering the windows, for lease, sign hanging crookedly on the door. There was no sign that the collector's cabinet had ever existed. But the bronze mirror was still in my hands, its surface now showing only my own frightened reflection. My coffee cup was gone, though I had no memory of dropping it. The pendant around my neck had cooled, but when I touched it, I felt unfamiliar ridges on its surface, new symbols that matched the ones carved around the mirror's edge. That night, the dreams began. I saw myself walking through endless corridors lined with display cases, each containing a different version of me, versions where I'd made different choices, lived different lives. In some, I was successful and happy. In others, I was broken and desperate. Some weren't quite human anymore. In every reflection, the jade pendant glowed with an inner light, while the bronze mirror showed only darkness. But in that darkness, something was moving, watching, waiting. And in every version of myself, across all those possible lives, I could see thin black tendrils connecting me to something vast and hungry that lurked just beyond the edges of reality. I woke to find the mirror hanging on my bedroom wall, though I distinctly remembered placing it on my dresser before going to bed. In its surface, shadows moved independently of any light source, forming patterns that almost resembled writing in an alphabet that hurt my eyes to look at. My phone rang, displaying an unknown number. When I answered, I heard only static and what sounded like distant screaming. Then a familiar voice, the old man from the shop. The mirror shows truth, Miss Chan, but are you prepared for what it will reveal about yourself? About the choices that led you to us? About the debt your grandmother left unpaid? His laughter echoed through the phone, and I heard other voices laughing with him, including one that sounded disturbingly like my own. Sleep well, dear customer. Tomorrow, your real education begins. I didn't sleep again that night. I couldn't, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mirror's surface rippling like black water, and in those ripples, countless versions of myself screamed silently for help. Morning came with a strange quality to the light, as if it were being filtered through dirty water. The mirror still hung on my wall, though I tried to remove it 3 times during the night. Each time I took it down, it would somehow reappear, and the reflection would show a slightly different version of my bedroom. One where the shadows were longer, the corners impossibly deep. I called in sick to the university. My department chair sounded concerned. I'd never missed a class before, but there was something more urgent I needed to investigate. I needed to understand what my grandmother had known about the pendant, about the shop, about everything she'd left unsaid. I drove to Chinatown, to the small apartment above the herbal medicine shop where she'd spent her final years. The current tenant was surprised to see me, but she remembered my grandmother. Strange lady, she said, always burning incense, always whispering to herself. Left a trunk in the basement, asked me to keep it safe, said someone would come for it eventually. The trunk was exactly where the tenant said it would be, covered in dust and cobwebs. The lock opened at my touch, as if recognizing me. Inside, I found stacks of journals written in my grandmother's precise calligraphy, mixing Chinese and English. Some pages contained diagrams that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Others were stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The earliest journal was dated 1965, the year she first came to America. The collector found me in Shanghai, said he could help me escape the Cultural Revolution, but his price was steep. A binding contract, signed in blood. I thought I was clever, adding my own conditions to the deal. But he's been collecting souls for centuries. He knows every trick, every loophole. The pendant is both protection and prison. It keeps the worst of them out, but it also marks me as his property. And now he wants more. He always wants more. Later entries became more disturbing. The mirror shows possibilities, all the lives we might have lived, all the choices we might have made. But it also shows them to them. They feed on potential, on dreams unrealized and paths not taken. Each reflection is a door, and they're learning to open them. I've seen what waits on the other side. I've seen what they do to the souls they collect. The shop appears when it wants to, where it wants to. It's not really a shop at all. It's a web, and the collector is the spider at its center. But even he serves something greater, something older, something that hungers for more than just souls. The final entry was dated 3 days before her death. May will inherit everything. The pendant, the responsibility, the debt. I've tried to prepare her, but they won't let me warn her directly. The contract forbids it. The mirror will find her soon. It has to be her. The bloodline is important to them. They believe certain families have greater potential, more possibilities to feed on. I've hidden what I can in these journals, encoded what I dare. I hope she's stronger than I was. I hope she can find a way to break the cycle. My phone rang again, another unknown number. This time, when I answered, I heard my grandmother's voice. Behind you. I spun around. The basement wall had become a mirror, and in it, I saw my grandmother as she must have looked in her youth. But her eyes were wrong. Solid black, with pinpricks of light like distant stars. Not quite, she said, her voice distorting. Just another possibility. Another path. Another meal. Her form shifted, becoming something else. Something that wore my grandmother's face like an ill-fitting mask. You have so many interesting possibilities, May. So many paths untaken. We're going to enjoy tasting each one. The mirror on the wall began to ripple, and through it stepped the collector, still wearing his perfect suit. Finding Grandma's little secrets, are we? How delightful. But you've only scratched the surface. Would you like to know what really happened to her? What happens to all our special customers? He held out his hand, those 2 long fingers beckoning. Come back to the shop. Let me show you. The shop isn't there anymore, I said, backing away. He laughed. The shop is everywhere. Every empty storefront, every closed door, every dark corner where possibilities gather. You just need to know how to look. He gestured to the mirror hanging on the wall of my bedroom, which was impossible, because I was in the basement, wasn't I? Your grandmother understood, in the end. As you will. Reality folded again, and I found myself back in the collector's cabinet. But it was different now. Larger, older, the shelves stretching up into infinite darkness. The displays were filled with versions of myself at different ages, frozen in various attitudes of terror or resignation. Welcome home, the collector said. Shall we begin your orientation? The shop's interior had transformed into an endless museum of possibilities. Each display case contained a moment frozen in time, versions of my life that could have been. In one, I saw myself as a child, taking a different path home from school. In another, I was accepting a research position in Beijing instead of Boston. Hundreds of choices, thousands of branching paths, each one preserved like a butterfly pinned to cork. Your grandmother was one of our most productive customers, the collector said, leading me deeper into the impossible space. So many interesting choices in her life, so many delicious possibilities. The Cultural Revolution alone generated enough alternates to feed us for decades. But you, his too-wide smile stretched even further. You have even more potential. We passed through a doorway that opened into what appeared to be an ancient Chinese tomb. Bronze vessels lined the walls, each containing shadowy shapes that moved and writhed. The air was thick with incense smoke that formed patterns I recognized from my grandmother's journals. This is where it began, the collector explained. Your ancestor, the sorceress Zhang Mei, made the first deal. She thought she could outsmart us, binding spirits into jade and bronze. But we are not spirits. We are the spaces between choices, the shadows cast by decisions unmade. And we were hungry even then. In the center of the tomb stood an altar, and on it lay my grandmother's body. Not as she looked when she died, but young, preserved at the moment she'd first entered the shop. Her eyes were open, solid black with pinpricks of light. She's not dead, the collector said, answering my unspoken question. Not exactly. Death is just another possibility. After all, one of many. Would you like to speak with her? It only costs a small piece of your future. The pendant around my neck burned cold. The mirror in my hands showed my grandmother's reflection, but she was moving independently, trying to tell me something. I focused on her lips, reading the words, the contract. There's a flaw. Time works differently here. Understanding clicked into place. My grandmother's journals, the encoded messages, the seemingly random patterns, they weren't just warnings. They were instructions. No deal, I said, holding up the mirror. In fact, I'm here to break an old one. The collector's smile faltered. You can't. The contract is binding. The bloodline is bound. But time works differently here, I said, remembering the precise words from my grandmother's journal. And the original contract was signed before I was born. You can't bind someone to a choice made before they existed. That's why you needed me to make a new deal. Why you orchestrated my finding the shop. The room began to shake. The bronze vessels rattled, their shadowy contents swirling faster. The collector's form flickered, showing his true shape, a void in reality, rimmed with hungry eyes. The mirror, I continued, my voice growing stronger. It doesn't just show possibilities. It shows truth. And the truth is, you have no power over me unless I choose to give it to you. I held up the mirror, and in its surface, I saw every version of myself across every possible timeline. But instead of fear, I felt understanding. Each reflection was a choice, yes, but they were my choices, my possibilities, not food for some ancient horror. I began to recite the words I'd found hidden in my grandmother's journals, encoded in the seemingly random patterns. It was a spell, but not one of binding or banishment. It was a spell of claiming, of ownership, of taking back what was stolen. The collector screamed, a sound that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. You can't. The possibilities, they're ours. We've fed on them since the first human looked at their shadow and wondered, what if? Not anymore, I said, and smashed the mirror. Reality shattered. I saw everything at once, every choice I'd ever made, every path I hadn't taken. They weren't lost possibilities. They were parts of who I was, who I chose not to be. The shop began to collapse, folding in on itself like origami in reverse. The collector reached for me with hands made of void and hunger, but they passed through me like smoke. "What have you done?" "Taken back my choices," I said. "All of them, even the ones I didn't make." The pendant around my neck shattered, and with it, the bindings that had held generations of my family. I saw them all at once. The sorceress Zhang Mei, my grandmother, every woman in my line who had been trapped by the collector's deals. They were free. I woke up in the basement where I'd found my grandmother's trunk. The journals were still there, but the writing had changed. Instead of warnings and encoded messages, they now contained stories, our family's true history, unmarred by deals with things that fed on possibilities. The mirror was gone. So was the pendant. When I walked back to campus, the empty storefront between the coffee shop and bookstore was just that, empty. Normal. No sign that anything extraordinary had ever happened there. But sometimes, when I pass by empty shops or dark windows, I catch glimpses of other possibilities. Not as meals for hungry things between worlds, but as reminders of all the choices that make us who we are. The paths taken and untaken, the doors opened and closed. I keep my grandmother's journals on my office shelf at the university. Students sometimes ask about them, and I tell them they're just old family stories. But occasionally, I see someone wearing a pendant that glows too warmly, or carrying a mirror that shows too much, and I know they've found their way into the collector's web. That's when I invite them into my office, make tea, and begin to tell them about choices, about possibilities, about the power of claiming your own path, about the difference between what we might have been and what we choose to be. Because some doors shouldn't be opened, but once they are, the only way forward is to walk through them on your own terms. To look into the mirror and see not what could have been, but what is, what we choose. The collector still exists, I'm sure. Things like that don't simply end, but he no longer feeds on my family's possibilities. Our choices are our own again, and if sometimes in my dreams I see other versions of myself living other lives, I don't fear them anymore. They're not lost possibilities or meals for ancient horrors. They're reminders of every choice that led me here, to this life, to this moment, this possibility, this truth, this path that I chose.